Good afternoon, Mr. Turner.
Good afternoon, my Lord. We have a panel this afternoon, my Lord, addressing funerals and death rituals. The panel consists of 4 members, Mr. Ravi Ladva, an advisor for the Scottish Hindu Foundation, Mr. Fraser Sutherland, who you met this morning, Mr. Ephraim Borowski, who you again met this morning, and Mr. Omar Afza, head of the Public Affairs and Communications Directorate at the Scottish Association of Mosques.
Very good. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Right, when you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my Lord. Good afternoon. A reminder, we are being transcribed today, so again, if you could speak slowly and clearly and avoid speaking over. If you have any points you want to raise, feel free to raise your hand. We work a bit like a primary school here in the sense that I'll probably ignore you for a few minutes, but I will get to you eventually. Mr. Sutherland, Mr. Borowski, this is your second session today. His Lordship has had the benefit of hearing about your roles and an outline of your organisations, and I won't ask you to repeat that evidence this afternoon. You've also confirmed that you've provided statements to the inquiry. Mr. Ladva and Mr. Afza, you have also provided statements to the inquiry. Mr. Ladva, your statement is reference SCI WT 0639 number 1. And Mr. Afza, your statement is reference SCI WT 0315 number 1. Now, everything in those statements, all of your statements, will be taken into account by the inquiry. We're going to touch upon some of the matters, obviously directed primarily at the funerals and rituals, but anything not touched upon will still be taken into account by His Lordship. Mr. Ladva and Mr. Afza, given that you've not had the opportunity to tell His Lordship who you are, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. And if I could ask you, please, firstly to confirm your full name, and then if I could ask you to provide some details about your organisations, their history and purpose, and also your role in the organisation. And perhaps you could also give us, if you've inclination, an outline of the number of people in the community that your organisation represents. Mr. Ladza, if I could come to you first of all, please.
So, thank you for having me. My name is Ravi Ladva. I work as an advisor for the Scottish Hindu Foundation. I have a background in Indian history and religious studies, in Hinduism as well. So I'm able to bridge gaps and provide insight into problem solving and other areas. The Scottish Hindu Foundation was officially incorporated in 2023, but has grew momentum in forming in 2021. Mostly out of the pandemic, when the core members came together across the different communities, areas of Hindus in Scotland. The primary function of the Scottish Hindu Foundation is to be a civic engagement body for the Hindus in Scotland with government and other public services where needs arise, and to provide a voice and opinion where it matters on Hindu issues and Hindu concerns.
Thank you. And are you able to give His Lordship an indication of the number of Hindus we have in Scotland?
So, according to the last census, we estimate there's anywhere between 30 to 40,000 Hindus in Scotland. But with migration students, and that population does fluctuate, so it can go up to 50, even 60,000, depending on which estimate you're going according to.
Thank you. And Mr. Afza, could I ask you to do the same, please?
Yeah, my name is Omar Afzal. I'm currently the head of the Public Affairs Directorate at the Scottish Association of Mosques. The Scottish Association of Mosques is a national voice for Muslims in Scotland. It's comprised of the largest mosques in Scotland, that's who constitutes its membership, and it's headed by an executive board, which is a board of imams, of religious leaders, and that's a permanent board. My role within the organisation is as the Director of the Public Affairs function, so government engagement, media work, policy work as well, all falls within my remit. Over COVID, during COVID, I was the head of mosques and communities at the Muslim Council for Scotland, and by de facto then became the national lead for COVID recovery and COVID response.
And again, are you able to give His Lordship an outline of the number of Muslims that we have in this country?
According to the last census, we are just under 120,000.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned at the outset, the purpose of this session is primarily to talk about funerals and death rituals. I'm going to come on to discuss the ceremonies and arrangements of funerals. But before I do that, I wonder if you could assist His Lordship, perhaps by giving an outline. This may, I appreciate, apply less to you, Mr. Sutherland, than perhaps your religious colleagues, but I wonder if you could perhaps give an outline of the beliefs or purposes that underlie death rituals. What are the beliefs that are being addressed in some of these rituals? Again, Mr. Ladva, could I perhaps come to you first?
Sure. So in Hinduism, we operate on one of the two core principles or philosophies of reincarnation and moksha. Moksha means liberation. And the idea of rituals concerning funeral practices is to give the soul the best chance to reincarnate or to achieve moksha. Now, break it up into segments because it's quite vast, but the reincarnation part essentially is tied to the other core principles of dharma, karma, artha, and moksha. So dharma is the idea of responsibilities that you have as you live your life. Karma or karma, as is the actions that you take and the ethical practices and the ethical frameworks that you exist. Artha is wealth, the how you've lived your life, the accumulation of wealth, was it done honestly? And then there's karma, which is passion, the did you enjoy life? Did you find your passion in life? Did you live life according to who you truly are, the best version of yourself? And there's multiple frameworks that go into it. All of this drives towards the average person or the average soul being the best version of themselves. Only when that is accomplished that the soul liberates and is freed from this constant cycle of rebirth and death and rebirth and death. So in Hindu practices, when funeral practices are conducted, they are designed to offer prayers and solace to those who are mourning, but also give the soul the opportunity and the blessings to free itself from the cycle of rebirth and death.
Thank you. Mr. Sutherland, could I come to you next? Again, perhaps could you give His Lordship an indication of the kinds of beliefs that humanists have in this regard?
Yeah, so for a humanist community, obviously, it's, as I mentioned in the first sector, it's non-religious. It's a non-religious identity, so it can be quite varied in terms of what the people come to us to ask to do. The ceremonies in terms of funerals can look quite different from one to another, and that reflects, obviously, the demands and the asks of the people arranging the funeral, or sometimes the people who have died, who have left their own wishes of what they would want to happen after their death. Sometimes the ceremonies can be quite sombre affairs, and sometimes they can be quite celebratory affairs. I mean, effectively, a humanist ceremony is very much about remembering the individuals. We don't have any kind of spiritual or other kind of practices. It's very much focused on the individual's life and telling their life story. I suppose in the sense of other types of funerals, it's like an extended eulogy, effectively, and it's very much focused around their life. But like I say, it can be quite different. The other thing to mention as well is that obviously we provide our services to the public at large, so non-religious people at large who not necessarily are members of the organisation. We have a small membership, but the services in terms of weddings, funerals and namings are offered generally to the public at large. So it's people who are non-religious who would choose to have a humanist funeral.
Thank you. And Mr. Borowski, could you assist us in Judaism?
Maybe I could start by going back to a question you didn't ask.
Right. By all means.
Which is how many Jewish people there are in Scotland. You asked of the two new panellists. It's an interesting question, and it actually bears on a lot of what we're talking about, because we know that the census says that there are approximately 6,400 and something people who tick the religion box in the census, and remarkably the same in 2022 as in 2011, within, I think, about 20, which nobody would have predicted. So effectively constant. But we know that there are lots of reasons why people don't tick the box, and a lot of that is historical desire not to let the authorities, whoever they might be, know that you're Jewish. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that was most remarkable, for me at any rate, in the 2022 census was we had persuaded NRS to include a prompt, not a tick box, in the ethnicity question for people to write in Jewish. And I expected that we might get maybe 8-10% at most. It actually added 26% to the total number. So there were 1,466 people in Scotland who had not ticked the religion box, who actually wrote in, deliberate act of writing in Jewish under the ethnicity question. So they weren't hiding, because they actually deliberately picked up a pen and wrote it. Now that actually, we haven't really worked our way through this yet, but that changes our perception of Jewish people in Scotland, hyphenated, as an entity. Because it means that there's a substantial proportion of people who identify as Jewish but not in religious terms. And that then changes how we might think people respond to the kinds of things that today's two sessions are about. So they're unlikely to engage in religious ceremonies because they didn't tick the religion box, but they are still identifying as Jewish. So the question is, how does that work out? How does it, what does that identification work out as in practice? So, moving on to death, one of the things that people do, I think, by and large, they may not join a synagogue or other Jewish organizations, but very often they do want to be buried in a Jewish way. And that, of course, that mismatch then causes problems for communal organizations that have to plan for these things as well. But Judaism in general is quite low on capital T theology and quite high on practice and custom. And therefore, I'm not going to answer the first half of your current question because that's a theological question. What I can do is to say that what people actually want, other than, as Woody Allen once said, to be heard breathing at their funeral, is for it to take place as quickly as possible. What would you like people to say about you at your funeral? I think I saw him breathe. I think I saw his chest move. People want a quick funeral. It's generally said that they want the funeral to take place within 24 hours. That's actually not correct. It's on the same day. So, for example, my late mother died at lunchtime and was buried at 6 o'clock that day. And that's not atypical. It's less typical than it used to be because people are coming from all over the world, whereas once upon a time they might have had to get here from Newington. And then there are rituals of preparing the body, use a plain coffin, and bury them in our own burial ground. But what then follows from that is a year of mourning rituals. First week of not going out, people come to visit, offer condolences, prayers are held in the house of the bereaved or indeed the deceased. And then 30 days of slightly less serious mourning, and then a year of saying special prayers, and then recognising the anniversary annually. So it's something that is very much a practical matter for observant Jews, carrying on these rituals. And that has a psychological effect as well, because whenever there are discussions about post-mortems or, for example, the Shipman inquiry, one of the points that was made on behalf of the Jewish community is that people can't start mourning, which is a psychological thing. They can't get into the right frame of mind until the funeral takes place. And therefore, if there's a postponement to the funeral, they're in psychological limbo. And we have to think about the bereaved as well as the deceased. So that's a fairly long answer. But it shows, I think, again, as the Bishop said before, all these faiths are different and have different emphases. And the ability to carry out those rituals is psychologically exceedingly important. And as I said in my written statement, it's actually important to recognise that for adherents of a religion, they are not optional. They are in their terms obligations. And I think it's important that, I mean, we're talking here at the interface of the state and faith. And I think that needs to be addressed perhaps a bit more than it very often is.
Thank you, Mr. Borowski. Mr. Afzal, I'm going to come and ask you about the rituals in a moment, but if I could go back to my question, first of all, regarding the beliefs, if I could address that first of all, and then we'll come on to the question of rituals and ceremonies in a moment. But if you could perhaps give us an outline, if you're able, of the kinds of beliefs that your members would believe in.
Sure. How long have you got? I suppose to answer.
Tee up for one of these afternoons.
If there's one thing faith communities like talking about, it's their faith. To answer your question, we probably have to look at two key pillars within our faith tradition. One is our core beliefs, and the other is our understanding of existence as well. So within our core beliefs, we have what is called as our complete faith, our Iman Mufassil, and within that we believe in one God. We're a monotheistic faith. We believe in angels, we believe in prophets, we believe in scripture, we believe in destiny, we believe in judgment, and we believe in life after death. So that's our complete faith, our articles of faith. In terms of our belief in existence, there's a narration in our holy book, the Quran, which talks about a time where God created Adam, and from the spine of Adam, he extracts the seed of man, and he spread the seed of man in front of him, and he gave them life, and he spoke to them, and he asked them, he says, in the Arabic, it's Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And the souls of mankind replied, yes, and we testify you're our Lord. And then God replies, he says, when it comes to your judgment, then you can't plead ignorance because you've seen me and you've attested your faith. That's a core part of our faith, which is known as our fitrah, our natural disposition. So our natural disposition is to be God-conscious and to live our lives in a God-conscious way. In terms of where death comes into that, death for us is part of that spectrum of existence where we had that time where we existed before this world. We've then got our time within this world, and then we've got our time in the afterlife, and part of the afterlife is judgment. So a funeral ritual for us is basically laying somebody to rest and sending them on to their onward journey. So for a pious soul, that is a return back to God and to being enveloped in His mercy. And for us, again, very similar to our friends in the Jewish community, there isn't actually a time limit, a time frame to perform funerals. They should be conducted as soon as possible. There's many kind of cogs that have to fall into place for that to happen, and we're grateful for the authorities for making that happen. But for us, It's really a case of sending the soul onwards to their next place in the afterlife.
Thank you. If I could continue with you, Mr. Afzal, for a moment and move on to the question of the rituals and the, I suppose, practical arrangements around funerals. Could you perhaps give His Lordship, again briefly, if we may, an indication of how funerals are arranged, who leads any funeral arrangements, and again an outline of the rites and rituals that are performed in relation to funerals?
So in terms of who arranges the funerals, within the Scottish Muslim community, it's mainly mosques who would do that. There is one private Muslim funeral director who covers the Edinburgh and Lothians area. For the rest of the country, it is mainly the mosques that do that. Within Glasgow, it's the Glasgow Central Mosque who do that. They're the largest and busiest Muslim funeral service in the country. In terms of the actual rituals, it would actually begin at the time of death. So at the time of death, family would be gathered around the person and they would be helped to pass on by reciting the declaration of faith. At the time of death then, the body would be prepared at that point, so the eyes would be closed, the person's mouth would be closed, and they'd be faced, their face would be turned slightly to the right, so that when they're buried, they're facing in the direction of the first house of worship in the holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So that all happens pretty much at the time of death. The Glasgow Central Mosque then, if we take them as an example, they would come to collect the dearly departed. They would take them to the mosque and they would then be kept in our care at the mosque on the mortuary on site. The funeral rituals then would begin with the family of the deceased and two mosque officials going through a ritual washing of the body known as the ghusl. After the ghusl, then the person is shrouded. After they're shrouded, there's then a funeral prayer. The person is then taken to the graveyard where they're buried, and at the burial then there's also a small service there as well. In Scotland, for practical purposes, we can join the funeral prayer with the afternoon Zohar prayer. We've got the 5 congregational prayers in the mosques. So the funeral prayer is conjoined with the afternoon prayer, and then it's after that the person is taken to the graveyard for the burial.
Thank you. You've mentioned in a couple of points in that process the involvement of family. You've also mentioned the afternoon prayers. Could you give His Lordship an indication? I appreciate that every funeral is different, but in terms of perhaps the average or a range of funerals, I mean, how many people are we talking about involved in these processes in an ordinary time? Sure.
So there is a bit of background to that as well. Within the Islamic faith, to fulfil the final rites of a deceased Muslim is a communal obligation. So it's an obligation upon the whole community to do that. If a small group of people then do that, they fulfil that obligation on behalf of the community. So this is why the people who conduct the funerals within our communities have an incredibly important role. Within that, our congregational prayers, when it comes to the funeral prayer itself, many people will attend a funeral out of a sense of duty and also as a sense of personal reflection as well, to remember their own mortality and to remember that they will also one day pass on. So on average at the Glasgow Central Mosque, you could have at the very bare minimum at least 100 to 150 people attending a funeral, and some of the larger funerals will go into the thousands.
Thank you. And just one final question. I think you maybe mentioned it before, but the final resting place in your tradition, is that a burial rather than a cremation?
Yep, it's burial.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Ladza, could I come to you now and effectively ask the same question?
Of course. In Hindu traditions, there's a caveat which is added that it will vary depending on which tradition you follow, or which sampradaya or community that you're a part of, and which part of India you hail from, or which part of the world, as Hindus are spread across the Caribbean, the Africas, Australasia and the Americas or Europe as well. So there's a malleable element to it, which is what's practical for those regions and what is inherently written in scripture as well. But they will all try to follow the same kind of pattern, which is there's worship and puja rituals before the body arrives, when the body arrives, and then the cremation process and afterwards. All in all, it usually lasts anywhere between 12 to 13 days, with the cremation happening somewhere in the middle. The traditional aspect of it is that if we were talking, almost blind adherence to scripture, the funeral process from death to cremation to everything being done would be somewhere in the region of 48 to 72 hours, in some cases even 72. The difference, one of the stark differences is that in traditional Hindu culture, the place of worship, the mandir, and the grave or the samshan, which is called the area where the body is prepared, would be completely diametrically in two different places. And there's lots of literature on this, and I've mentioned this in the report or the statement that I've said, is that pertinent to the COVID inquiry, Hinduism has literature on pandemics and epidemics. We have a deity dedicated to medicine and epidemics in particular, called Lord Dhavantri, which outlines what to do, what not to do, in line with Hindu principles. So there is vast amounts of literature that we could and had the opportunity to dive into. So when it came to funeral practices, we had ample information to say, okay, what is the government asking us, what's scripture asking us, and what are the practicalities of conducting these funeral rites within a Hindu fold that doesn't take away from the spiritual aspects of the funeral rites. So starting off, when the person passes away, the body is cleaned, prayers are held, and then they are taken away to be prepared. More services are held in honor of the body. Body is then usually taken to an area where it's cremated. The ashes are gathered, and then they're scattered near a flowing body of water. And then afterwards, there's a communal meal where everybody is fed, and more prayers and services are held in remembrance and helping the people overcome their grief, is the best way I can describe it. Now, each community, whether you're Tamil, Gujarati from the north, or any other kind of breakdown of diaspora for Hindus, will have their own either family rituals or their own regional variations on these kind of process. So obviously through COVID, the Hindu community found it quite challenging in meeting some of these requirements, where in some instances only 6 family members were allowed in the cremation hall. Everybody else was kind of relegated to Zoom calls and watching these things unfold. So I could speak from my own personal experiences where family members have passed away. I'm the only one here in Scotland, and most of my family are in Birmingham. So watching people I grew up with, aunts and uncles, pass away, and then having to watch their funerals on Zoom unfold was difficult. And towards the end, when it just became difficult, I was to the point where passing on my condolences, passing on love and all the things. And if I was in the mental health space to join, I would. If I didn't, then everybody was understanding. And that was the same across the board for here in Scotland as well. I can give you an example in Dundee, where we found out quite quickly, where Dundee doesn't have a resident priest, a Brahmin, to conduct rituals. The community was basically working on memory knowledge as to what they thought the correct prayers would be. And they tried to do their best to give the correct send-off and perform the correct rituals. And that was something that was a bit of an eye-opener, that in times of need, this community was reliant on a priest coming up from Edinburgh, Glasgow, or Aberdeen, to support them. And when they felt isolated, this really important moment in a family's journey in mourning or person's passing, there was a bit of a gap, and it was difficult to process and difficult to support them. But we did what we could with what we had.
In terms of Scotland in particular and the conduct of Hindu funerals. You've mentioned cremation. I mean, is that the manner in which funerals are conducted?
Hindus will traditionally cremate themselves. The body is seen as a vessel for the soul. In Hindu scripture, it's described as when a person dies, it's like a person taking off clothes and putting on a new pair. The soul just is transient. It moves onto its next part of the journey. If it's fortunate to have lived in a dharmic way, it will then free itself from this constant cycle of rebirth and death. Otherwise, it will go into the next life looking for the things that it needs to attain moksha, attain liberation. It's never a punishment. It's designed to, again, help people be the best version of themselves, to attain the things that the soul requires to liberate itself.
Thank you. We heard from Mr. Afzal regarding the private facilities that Glasgow Mosque has in terms of conduct of mortuary services and the like. We heard from Mr. Sutherland that humanists tend to use publicly available services. What's the position with Hindus in Scotland? Do they have their own crematoria, or are they using public services?
For large part of the Scottish community, Hindu community, we use the public services that are available for crematoriums. There are only a handful of temples that I know that have separate areas where the body can be prepared and the temple. And large in part, we rely on public services to help prepare the body ready for cremation.
Thank you. Again, Mr. Sutherland, you're in a slightly different category, I appreciate, to your colleagues, but perhaps you could give his lordship an indication, if I may, of the I suppose the kind of services that humanists provide in relation to funerals.
Yeah, I mean, the practicalities would be handled most commonly, almost exclusively, by funeral directors, who I know you'll be hearing from later in your sessions, and they would obviously handle a lot of the practical arrangements. Where the humanist would come into perspective is creating that ceremony, and as I mentioned in my first answer, those ceremonies can look quite different depending on obviously the family involved and the person who has died and what they wish to be reflected as part of the ceremony. So they can be quite different. I think in keeping with the broader statistics that you can see in terms of how people are handled after their death, the majority of people would get cremated, with the exception that where people are living in areas without crematoria, they would be buried if they're having a humanist funeral. But most people who have a humanist funeral, it would be in a crematorium, and that's where it would be held. There's not any special, obviously, from a humanist perspective, beliefs about kind of afterlife or anything. So there's no consideration around that. It would typically, and again in keeping with, I suppose, the majority of the funerals in the country, would typically be around about 7 days or whatever, a week to 10 days would be not uncommon time frame after death for a funeral to happen. Differs in local communities depending on obviously the availability of services and the funeral directors and what their processes are. But this, in terms of the humanist celebrant involvement, it's very much they would spend quite a bit of time, and this is where a significant change during the pandemic happened. They would spend quite a bit of time with the family to understand the deceased. I mean, one of the compliments often, we would get after a humanist funeral is that attendees would often comment that they felt that the celebrant knew the person, and that's because the celebrant's biggest role, I think a lot of people feel like the work is done delivering the service, but actually the biggest part of the work is actually the sitting down with the family and the friends, interviewing different people and getting a sense of the individual so that you can write kind of a ceremony that reflects their life and the life that they lived. And that's really where the effort comes in. Now, of course, during the pandemic, that was made very difficult because people were living in different places. Things had to be done remotely, whereas normally a celebrant would very much go to the house of the family, so there can be a personal connection between the mourners and the celebrant who would be leading the service. And so having to do that over the phone, some of the feedback we got from, or via Zoom or whatever, made that job a lot more difficult because people are very closed, particularly when they've just suffered a bereavement. So getting, there's ways if you're in person to make people feel comfortable and make them, give you more information, but when you're speaking to someone over the phone, that can be really difficult to get that kind of information out of them. And there's also it was touched on in the first session about that pastoral support. There is an element of the celebrant being there and talking about the deceased and about the memories that is a part of a pastoral and a grieving process. And when you don't have that face-to-face contact, there was definitely something taken away from that. We all understand the reasons why that was put in place because of the risk related to COVID, but it's certainly something that was very strongly put back to me by celebrants, that inability to have that personal conversations between the families who were arranging the funeral and the celebrant. There was just something missed out from what we would normally do.
Thank you. Mr. Borowski, you've given us a bit of an indication in terms of some of the ritual side of the Jewish practices. I'm going to ask you in a moment just about some of the changes to that that occurred during the pandemic, but just one final question before I do move on to the changes. Are you able to give His Lordship an indication of the importance or otherwise of the funeral rituals to people of Jewish faith?
Thanks. As I said before, I think it's psychologically very important to the bereaved. I quoted the response from the Jewish community to the Shipman inquiry. People cannot feel that they cannot begin mourning until the funeral has taken place, and they're in limbo. And that's part of the reason why people want the funeral to take place as quickly as possible. The other thing is, exactly as Omar said, in terms of religious requirements, that's a separate matter of, if you like, religious law. And really, I think every single word that you said, with one exception, and that is that we pray 3 times a day, not 5 times a day. In other words, completely trivial. But with that exception, you might as well have been describing our position as your own. And in opposition to what Fraser said, every Jewish funeral is pretty much identical. Sometimes, as someone who has attended too many of them, even down to the speech, which is identical. But the actual practice, the other aspect of it in ritual terms is the washing, preparation, clothing of the body, again, exactly as Omar described. And that was something that was clearly affected by the pandemic. And I mean, I know that advice was taken from the rabbinical authorities in the UK, the Court of the Chief Rabbi, about the precise details of what could and could not be dispensed with. For example, not washing the body, but ritually pouring water over it. Not clothing the body, but laying the shrouds, the body being in a body bag inside the coffin, and laying the shrouds in the coffin, so that the people who are preparing the body, who are providing the last kindness to the deceased, were able to do that, but in a minimal way. So there were those adjustments made in order to comply with religious custom and requirements, while at the same time recognising the need to comply also with the legislation regulations in civil law.
Did those changes have any particular, or those or other changes have any particular effects on the members of the community? Were they accepting in those changes?
As we said in other contexts this morning, I think people accepted the need for these regulations, felt very frustrated by them. We're obviously always pointing out inconsistencies between the regulations here and the regulations there, which might be inconsistencies across the border, or it might be inconsistencies as I said in my statement, between pubs and prayer. I mean, there are all the landscape was so complex that it was always possible to find something that you could describe as an inconsistency. And when it suits people, of course, obviously, they need to blame somebody, so they'll pick on that. But really, they had no alternative. The structure of the community is such, actually, that each community has completely different arrangements in this area. In Glasgow, the main burial societies own their own cemeteries. In Edinburgh, the Orthodox community rents a section of a privately owned cemetery. The Liberal community in Edinburgh, the Reform community in Glasgow, use sections of a local authority cemetery. The smaller communities, I think there's been one funeral, I think, in the last 20 years outside Glasgow and Edinburgh. There are tiny Jewish cemeteries or corners of cemeteries in Falkirk and Greenock and Aberdeen and Inverness. I've no idea when the last time there was a funeral there. And I certainly don't know anything to do with the ownership. So that obviously, you're having to go through intermediaries all the time. And certainly, every community, I think, uses the services of a commercial undertaker to pick up the body, transport the body, so on. They might have their own premises for preparing the body, which certainly the ones in Glasgow and the community in Edinburgh have. But it is exceptionally complex and difficult. There was once a suggestion that there should be reciprocal burial rights so that people who move, which is much more common obviously nowadays than it was a generation ago, people who've been paying subscriptions into one burial society could use the services of another, and it turned out they were in fact legally incompatible. There are just so many different models. So it's very difficult to give you a single answer. This time, unlike this morning, not because I don't know, but because I know too much.
Thank you. Mr. Afzal, could I come to you next? And again, if I could ask you perhaps to address two matters. If you could perhaps give His Lordship an indication of some of the changes that occurred to funeral and death rituals, and again, the effects on the community, whether those were accepting, whether there was any pushback, any issues that arose arising from that.
Sure. I think it's important to recognise, first of all, that we were in uncharted territory, and I think that would probably go for the entire country. There wasn't any precedence as to how we would deal with a COVID death. So we were very much kind of working at pace to try and develop our own guidance within the community for how we could facilitate funerals. At the very start, it meant that if there was a COVID death, the scholars and the imams had given specific rulings for a range of scenarios as to how we could facilitate that. To start with, when a COVID deceased would come to us, they would be in a bag. The bag wouldn't be labelled. So what we would do in that circumstance is we would, rather than performing the full ritual wash, we would just pass some water ceremonially over the bag and then cover the bag with a sheet. And that was to begin with until we could work out protocols and get some further guidance from the health executive and others. That caused a lot of difficulty within our community, particularly since there's a community element to our funerals. And the families are very much involved within the funeral rites from the very beginning, from when somebody is actually at the point of death right the way through to the burial. So even at the point of death, helping somebody to recite the declaration of faith at the time of death, right the way through to being involved with the actual washing and then at the burial as well. Again, I'm going to use the example of Glasgow Central Mosque. What they did was they set up two separate ecosystems. So they had one ecosystem which dealt with standard deaths and burials, and the other ecosystem dealt with COVID deaths. The lay of the land in the Glasgow Central Mosque is that there's a railway bridge that runs along the boundary of the mosque. So they converted one of the arches under the railway bridge into a temporary facility. So any COVID death that came, rather than bringing the person into our care at the very start and then kind of being in the mosque mortuary, they came directly from the hospital mortuary right the way to that arch, so that the rituals could start. So that was one major change. The other major change was the fact that we were using crews to actually do the ritual washing. So rather than the family being involved, to reduce the risk of infection and spread, it was just the mosque officials, the funeral services team, that was conducting the ritual washes. And that continued on throughout the pandemic. So if somebody within one of those crews, for example, contracted COVID, that crew would be retired, then another crew would take over. So we had these two separate ecosystems to run that. The effects that it had on our community was that community members couldn't take part in those rituals. As I mentioned, it's a communal obligation, and the community all feels invested and part of somebody's final rites and their funeral and their burial as well. There was many situations that arose as a result of that, where families were upset. And they were coming to terms with the loss of a loved one, and over and above that, they were then being denied the ability to actually fulfil their final rites. For a son to be able to do that for a parent, for a child to do that for the parent, or for somebody to do that for a sibling or a loved one, is an incredibly important part of the grieving process and the bereavement process as well. The period of mourning for Muslims as well is 3 days after the funeral. Then within that, there's different rites and traditions that would take place. Within, for example, one part of the community, within the Sufi tradition, they would have gatherings where they would be loud chanting and reciting in a communal nature, in a communal setting. That couldn't happen. Normally, the family, the extended family or neighbours would cook for the family of the bereaved family. They would support them. They would go over to their house to offer prayers and condolences as well. None of that could happen either. So everything pretty much from point of death right the way through to bereavement and mourning as well, what was affected. We had times when there was standoffs in the mosque. So, for example, there was these different caps for different things. So there was a cap of 50 for worship, but then there was a different cap for funerals. So in a situation where we would be conjoining the funeral prayer and the afternoon prayer, you would then have a situation where 50 would be there for the afternoon prayer, but then you'd have to kind of cut that down to 20 for the funeral. In that circumstance, what we did was we didn't do the funeral prayer at the mosque, then we did it at the graveyard. The graveyards in Glasgow are public cemeteries where there's a Muslim section, so we couldn't really stop people from coming to the cemetery either. And again, there was situations where families were really upset. Some families were fairly big, and 20 wouldn't even scratch the surface of family members being able to be involved. There's one case that always sticks out to me of a very well-known butcher in the Pollokshields area of Glasgow who passed away. He'd been around in the community for a very long time, very well respected, and a lot of people wanted to go for his funeral and they couldn't because of the caps that were in place. I think the point that Ephraim made is a pertinent one in terms of religious literacy within authorities, within the Parliament, within the civil service, and being able to use that information to then bring in place caps and policies and procedures that would actually help us, rather than causing these situations where people who are already upset, already grieving, are then having their ability to fulfil their religious rights for their loved ones also restricted as well.
It's perhaps implicit from what you've just said there, Mr. Afzal, but do you feel that the approach that was taken by the Scottish Government in relation to those restrictions and more generally in terms of their knowledge and approach. Do you feel that was satisfactory, or do you think there is a better way?
I think there was a better way, and this is probably something we'll touch on in coming evidence sessions. But in terms of, for example, how caps were applied within places of worship, or how those caps related to different aspects of worship, for example, the funeral prayer versus the congregational, the standard congregational prayer. I think there could have been more done in terms of understanding how that works for communities and the importance of those forms of worship to those communities, and actually the effect that it had on them. In some cases, I would describe the effect of not being able to fulfil your religious obligations or your religious rights. It almost had an element of physical pain to it when you looked at people or spoke to people about the effects that it had on them. There was another case that always stands out to me of a funeral where the gentleman, his father had passed away, and the funeral services team, the lead on that day was actually his next door neighbour. So the funeral lead was burying his next door neighbour, and this gentleman was burying his father, and he was pleading with the funeral services lead to let him go into the hearse with the hearse driver to take his dad to the graveyard, and the funeral services lead had to deny his neighbour that right, and the person was pleading with him. I was there at the time. He was pleading with him. He was saying, and he said to him, out of respect, it's a term of respect in our community, you call the elders uncle. So he said, "Uncle, I grew up in your hands. Let me ride in the hearse with my dad." And he had to say no, because that was a policy that we'd put in place to keep people safe and to avoid transmission. And there's so many stories like that from across the country in different scenarios of how this really had a profound effect on both how we conducted funerals, on those who were responsible for making those decisions and carrying out those rituals on behalf of the communities, but also on the communities and the families themselves.
Thank you. Mr. Ladza, could I come to you now? Perhaps you could outline any changes that affected your community and indeed the impacts of those.
There was quite a few profound ones. Just to dovetail off of that, I'll start with the macro and then go down to the micro. In the midst of the pandemic, the Hindu community found itself under attack from the media, which was an interesting proposition. I distinctly remember this because I was asked by community members, what should our position be? And this happened during when the pandemic really took grip in Italy, and Milan in particularly, where morgues were filling up, and it was quite harrowing tales coming out. But the media, for some reason, out of respect and the way that they were treated, we won't show any photos, we won't do any media coverage of it. We will just tell the story as it is. But had no problems of portraying Hindu funeral pyres in India and the tone was, this barbaric, kind of, backward kind of practice. I remember reading one article saying, what would the environmental impact be of all these funeral pyres? To which we found ourselves, I don't think you really have dived deep into the science behind why Hindus cremate themselves and why it's beneficial in the long term to the environment. And, we find ourselves having to go through, scientific journals to explain and to defend ourselves in why some of these practices are important to us. And it's often, at least within the community, described as one of the first incidences of Hinduphobia in the media, and why our practices we're having to defend our practices. And I think it was kind of brought to the fore here, where there is a distinction between Hindu or dharmic practices and what we traditionally regard as Abrahamic practices. And I think one of the key lessons that, again, mentioned in this, in my statement, is the time to taking time to understand what the rationale is behind the practice. And I think I can speak for all the faith traditions that there is rationale, there is reason behind, and even logic behind why these practices matter, whether it's a spiritual or scientific, whichever path you wish to take. There will be literature, there will be someone there to explain this is why it's important. But for some reason, the Hindu community was never afforded that, And in fact, instead we find ourselves on the back foot fighting on social media with these articles that are, portraying these funeral pyres. And this comes back down to the practice in of itself, where the lighting of the funeral pyre is one of the most poignant and marked occasions in any family's journey. It's something that I'm cognizant of as the eldest son. I do have an elder sister, but it's something that will pass on to me when family members pass away, that I will be there to not necessarily light the fire, but to be there on the final send-off when they are cremated. And it cascades across the rest of the community, where it's something that we're all kind of cognizant of. This crossroads will come, and the Antim Sanskar, the final rituals, through the pandemic and for the Hindu community, it was about, okay, we understand that these are our spiritual practices and these are our guidance, but we, as part of the Scottish community, have to be pragmatic. So we didn't question why only 6 members were allowed in the crematorium when the approximate capacity for a crematorium is anywhere between 100 to 200 people. How they arbitrarily arrived at the number is something we still don't have an answer for. Why certain practices and certain things, especially concerning temples, where we couldn't go in, where the families couldn't go in to, say final prayers in the temple, without the body. Again, these are things that we said, okay, this is what the government has said, this is what we require. And again, because we have a literature and an understanding of and a history of dealing with epidemics and pandemics, we acquiesced to be a part of the team, to be part of the fight back against COVID, shall we say. And one of the important and interesting things is that a lot of our community members are on the front line of the NHS and public services. So, we were getting intimate details of their struggles and their pressures. So when, patients or, family members would pass away, they would, again, go back to the front line. Okay, I don't have, as much as I'd love to mourn, my duty to my community and to the rest of Scotland comes first. This is what we call the difference between kartavya and dharma. So dharma is the things that uphold society and the rituals and practices and traditions. And kartavya is your immediate duty, your immediate things that I ought to do this instant. And it's a constant tug of war between these two things, where Hindus are deciding, okay, this is what I would like to do, but however, it's superseded by the greater good for the rest of the community. At a micro level, at a community level, as I mentioned, the tradition is that when the body is cremated, it's scattered in a flowing body of water. The premise behind, again, the rationale behind that is that as a human, you've lived your life living off the earth. In your final kind of act, you're giving now back. Through a flowing body of water, it goes back to nature and it enters the water cycle, and and there again, there's many reasons and many scientific articles about the benefits of this. But I think in Scotland, at least, there's only a handful of places where Hindus can do that, and we have to go to the council to make an application. It then gets approved, and then we go along to do it. Again, we've taken it as this is what the state policy is. We will amalgamate and we will acquiesce to this is what the policy is. Thankfully, there is a review in the UK Parliament about crematorium services and funeral rites, and hopefully there will be some compromise on what we require to fulfill our religious and spiritual obligations. But I just wanted to highlight that just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. And the way that it's often portrayed and the way that the Hindu community is portrayed is kind of backwards. Like, we don't know what we're doing, honestly, half the time. And it's one of the things that the reason why the foundation was formed in the first place, which is there's no excuses. You can come and approach us and ask the questions. The foundation will provide an answer. And this is one of the lessons that was learnt through the pandemic, which is when the Hindu community was very much regionally organised. Glasgow had a base, Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen had very strong bases. Without a national kind of viewpoint and a national body to speak on these national issues, it's very hard to, A, filter information, and cascade information down, but also difficult to cascade information up to say that, by the way, you need to stop this. This is not appropriate. And if you do wish to do it, then we'll show you how to do it tastefully and respectfully. But that always comes with a caveat that, we will do it on our own time, and we will do it if we want to do it. There's never that kind of respect that's given. But with funeral rites in particularly, it's one of those passages of life that, whilst the reincarnation element is there and it's treated as a blink of an eye that the soul passes, the psychological aspects of it, these rituals and practices and the prayers that we have, are there for the mourners as well, to help them manage their grief and to overcome it. And through the pandemic, having seen and experienced and discussed with many of the people, we were fortunate enough to scramble together the online services where community could still come together to do prayer services, to do yoga, to do other kind of activities where it still maintained some semblance of community and acts of worship together that really got people through it. But this is one of the things where, again, in the statement written that it does require review, and it's something that has not been forgotten, how we were treated and how our practices and rituals were portrayed.
Thank you. Mr. Sutherland, could I ask you about the changes? You've mentioned some of the changes that were made by humanists. Could I ask you if there's any others you want to highlight, and any particular issues that you came across? I was listening to this morning's evidence, and you mentioned in relation to weddings, non-compliance by others, not obviously yourselves, but by others. You've mentioned that you had partnership working, obviously, with crematoria and others. Did you find similar experiences in terms of compliance in that sector as well, or?
I would say actually the complete opposite, really. I mean, the relationships with, I think because everybody who is involved in a funeral, and certainly in the funerals that our settlements carry out, was very much on the same page. So because you were dealing with funeral directors, crematoria, staff, or burial staff, everybody was keeping to their own sets of restrictions, which were all very similar. And perhaps, unlike what I was saying about weddings, the problem with the issue with weddings was that obviously the people, the hosts of those weddings, were commercial hospitality organisations who were massively impacted by the fact that they couldn't trade as they normally would. And so the pressure on them to push the boundaries, because it was, for some of them, if they weren't able to do that, they would go out of business, and that's what was pressurising them to make those decisions, and that's what led to the conflict. The difference here was there was no such pressure, effectively, to, there was no pressure to get more work in, because obviously there was a peak in deaths, and so there was, lots of services being held at crematorium. There was no lack of demand if it were to be seen like that, but also because you had very strict compliance with the rules, it was very easy for everyone to be essentially singing from the same hymn sheet, for a term, that the crematoria and the funeral director and the celebrant would all be saying the same thing, so it made it much easier for families to kind of accept that was what was going to happen. The challenge, when I was saying with weddings, was they were getting different answers from different people. So the celebrant would tell them one thing, the venue would tell them something different, the photographer would tell them something different. So you'd be getting a mixed set of messages. That did not happen at funerals. I think in terms of some of the changes and the big impact, I mean, it echoes what you've already heard. Numbers attending was a massive challenge, obviously, particularly where there was a lot of people wanting to attend, and then next of kin being able to make a decision about who can and who couldn't attend the ceremony was very difficult. I don't think we should underestimate how challenging that was for a lot of people. Also, the lack of human touch and the lack of being able to sit with members of your family. So, of course, people were split in crematoria, for example, by households, and quite frequently, in fact, in a lot of ceremonies, you would have the spouse of the deceased sat on their own, because they would be quite often the only person left from that household. I mean, obviously, we all remember the images of the late Queen sitting at her husband's funeral on her own, but that was replicated every day across crematoria, that someone would be sat on their own. They'd come from the house on their own, they'd sit in the crematoria on their own, and then they go home to sit on their own. I don't think there's ever been a full recognition of the impact on grief that has had for so many people, that they will ultimately still be carrying to this day. Because there is something about, whether it's a son or a daughter or a brother or a sister or a close friend, just sitting with someone, being able to comfort them, hold their hand, that is so meaningful in a human interaction, that I'm sure is similar across all of our belief systems. And the fact that that couldn't happen has definitely had a huge, huge impact. In terms of impacts on celebrants, the other thing that came very strongly back from celebrants who were very busy at that time was the inability for them, often, particularly with difficult funerals, so that might be for children, babies, funerals that might involve someone who'd taken their own life, or had met a violent death. They're very difficult funerals to deliver, but the network of celebrants is very important to each other. They can go and kind of, have a coffee with each other and kind of let off, a bit of the pressure that's built up. And definitely what came back was, obviously, they were having to go home on their own and take a lot of the kind of the pressure and the grief that they also were taking on behalf of the family and everyone else. And there was no ability to kind of just connect with, other celebrants or funeral directors. It's quite common for a celebrant funeral director to have a very close relationship, and they might go for a coffee afterwards and kind of help decompress some of the challenges that particular difficult funerals can bring up. So that inability to have the human contact, I don't think we should underestimate how much that will definitely impact people even to this day.
You mentioned this morning your involvement with the Faith and Belief group in the Scottish Government. Were any of these kinds of matters discussed in that context or fed back in terms of some of the impacts?
Definitely. I mean, there was a lot of conversation around how many people could attend funerals and, the reasons why more people, and there was strong arguments made about people sitting with, other members of the family that were not bubbled together, for example, for exactly the reasons that I've just mentioned. Yeah.
And do you feel the government understood, acknowledged and responded positively to that?
I mean, I certainly think, as I said this morning, that the government certainly were listening. Whether that impacted any of the decisions is obviously a matter for them to answer. But I certainly felt that we were always given the opportunity to have our say, and that what we were saying was heard. Some of these things changed, but they didn't change for quite some time, and so therefore, we weren't necessarily aware of where was that information going and who was making the decisions. That wasn't something that was obviously, fed back to us. But certainly the civil servants that we spoke to were always taking on board our points and putting it into the decision-making process, as it were.
Thank you. I'm conscious that time has gotten away from us a little. We have a few minutes left, and what I would like to do now, if there's anything else that I'm going to come to each of you individually, if there's anything else that you would like to highlight to His Lordship just now, this will be your opportunity to do so. And Mr. Borowski, if I could perhaps start with you as you're smiling at me.
I wasn't deliberately smiling at you. I do apologise. I think everything that Fraser's just said would be applicable probably to all of us, because that's in general terms the relationship between the people who are organising a funeral and the people, I was going to say for whom they're doing it, but the person for whom they're doing it is no longer around, but the family, the bereaved, the mourners. But the other point I'd like to pick up and maybe just underline is what Ravi said a few minutes ago, which relates to something that we talked about this morning as well, which is the importance of understanding where people are coming from. Now, in our case, that's in a religious context. And I made the point in an entirely different context, I think, in my statement about, in the context of hate crime, how important it is that the police and others shouldn't say, don't be silly, you're being oversensitive, whatever it might be. They should ask why the person who's reporting an incident regards it as a hate incident. What was it about the language or the circumstances or the gestures or whatever? Always ask why. And the same, I think, is true here. I made the point before about the psychological impact on the family of delays to funeral rituals and so on. It's very easy from, forgive me, a secular with a small s point of view, the supposed rationalist who says, oh, you're just being silly, and not taking account of how people internalize the rules of their own religion, whichever religion it might be. And I think that's true at every level of all of this, the importance of asking people to explain what it is that motivates what it is they're asking for. Why they think it's important, why they think it's urgent, why they think it's necessary. Because it's the understanding of that and then trying to address not the symptom but the cause, to put it in those terms, that will help them adjust to the stress that they are being put under by being refused what they've actually always taken for granted. So I think that's another common thread amongst all of us, but also amongst these various issues that we've been exploring today.
Thank you. Mr. Afzal, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I think one thing I would add is around communication, and in particular around where there was differences between what was happening in the rest of the UK and what was happening in Scotland. We had a situation very early on in the pandemic where emergency legislation was being passed in England, and an element of that was that in extreme cases we may have to cremate bodies. Now, we had a separate Burial and Cremation Act here in Scotland, which meant that what was being passed down south didn't really apply to us. But unfortunately, as is always the case, the miscommunication has done the rounds, and it's caused fear, alarm and panic within communities before we've had a chance to actually get the correct information out. And I think that is something that we really need to work on in terms of ensuring that we're getting the right information out to communities in a timeliest manner. It took myself to phone the Scottish Government, the Civil Service, to ask for parts of the Act that applied to us, for us to then craft that into a message and get that out to our community, by which time we'd lost a lot of ground. And when I'd phoned that department in the Scottish Government to ask for that clarification, the gentleman on the phone said, oh, Ephraim's already been on the phone to me. So it was something that was not just unique to our community, but actually it was across communities that this had happened. So I think that's really important. Along with that, again, I'm going to reiterate the point of the kind of religious literacy within both the Scottish Government as a civil service and within the Scottish Parliament as our elected representatives. Very often, as Fraser and Ephraim have said, we were communicating our thoughts and our needs, our experiences to the civil service, but where that then went on to and what decisions were actually made, we don't know what happened within that process, but certainly the civil service element, which is the faith and belief team, which came out of what was at the time the Connected Communities Directorate, were listening. As I say, where that information went and how that then translated into policy, that's really where the inquiry has, I think, a bit of work to do to understand.
Thank you. Mr. Ladsa, briefly, if we may.
The critical thing that we have learned is that the Hindu community will find a way. The challenges, whatever it is coming our way, with or without government support, we will find a way. Just to kind of highlight a few things, through the Sewa Day campaign, 3.5 tonnes of food was raised. ISKCON, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, fed 50,000 people. That program is still going, feeding people that are in need. the All India Association raised funds and bought oxygen machines for hospitals in India. And there are countless organisations that, came together with, or in some instances, without a acknowledgement from government to respond to this crisis. As far as the community is concerned, we've addressed one of the critical parts, which was that there was no organisation to deal with the government directly. It's now up to the government to learn from its lessons and engage with us in a meaningful way. So when situations do arise, touch wood, there's no other pandemic or epidemic, but in other times of crisis, to learn lessons and to engage with communities in a more meaningful way. But again, things I've covered in my statement, all the challenges that we've overcome, and how we've responded as a community to make sure people weren't isolated, to make sure people had equipment so they could join via Zoom, or even if it's simple as finding them a mouse or an old smartphone so they could see services being streamed. These are all things that have highlighted the resilience within the community, that we will find a way to either contribute or to support one another in times of needs. And we don't just see the community as Hindus, we see it as the whole Scottish community, and we will continue to do that.
Thank you. And Mr. Sutherland, last words if you have any.
There's a couple of things. One was, we had expected to see perhaps an increase in what we would call memorial ceremonies. So if I separate out funerals being a ceremony where the body is present, and then a memorial where there isn't, and that would happen at a later date. Because of the restrictions, there was often conversations with families, well, once restrictions are lifted, we could do obviously a memorial, and we could do that as part of the kind of agreement that we've also done the funeral for you. Thought that would be popular, but it wasn't really taken up as much, and we had done a lot of planning around it, but it was never really taken up by families. So again, I think that just underlines the point that for many people it has to happen at the point of death, and it is a growing popularity, memorial ceremonies, but still there's something about, even for kind of secular rationalists, there is something about it happening at the time of death that's important. The other thing is, again, just to underline the point, I made this a wee bit in the opening session this morning, but that as organisations who are saying to communities about the rules, etc., and emphasising the need to follow rules, it was really difficult when key decision makers and politicians were breaking those rules, and were covered quite extensively in the press. Breaking those rules, and you're saying, that anecdote that Omar gave about the man who couldn't travel with his father in the hearse, or I was referencing people who couldn't sit with their mother at the funeral of their father. That those impacts of those events, and us having to say to them, but that's what you have to do, and then to be able to see very high profile people making decisions, just not keeping to the rules, made it really difficult.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time this morning, my lord. I have no further questions unless your lordship has anything to add.
No, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all. Stimulating again, I have to say. It's been an eye-opener, both these sessions in actual fact, and very insightful. Thank you very much indeed. I'm bound to say, in fairness, that you told me a lot of things this afternoon that I did not know, but I do now. Thank you. Very good. 2:30. No, good afternoon, Ms. Baraba.
Good afternoon, my Lord. Our next panel this afternoon is on the matters of closure of religious buildings, pastoral care and the impact on the wider community. In this panel we have Reverend Brian Kerr of the Church of Scotland. We have the Reverend Donald George MacDonald of the Free Church of Scotland, and we have Ravi Ladva of the Scottish Hindu Foundation.
Very good. I've met two of you already, but welcome, welcome back to you, and welcome to you, Mr. Kerr. Thank you. Right, on you go, Ms. Baraba.
Thank you, my Lord. Now, I just want to, two of you have already heard this, but just for completeness, the proceedings are being transcribed, so please try to speak slowly and clearly. Please also try to avoid speaking over each other. I'm sure you wouldn't do that purposefully anyway. As His Lordship has acknowledged, Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Ladva, he has already had the benefit of hearing from you about your organisations and your roles in those organisations, and the fact that you have provided witness statements. So, Mr. Kerr, you have also provided a witness statement. The reference number for your statement, for the benefit of the record, is SCI WT 0633-501. Mr. Kerr, please would you tell His Lordship about your organisation, the community you serve, your background and your role with the organisation, both now and during the pandemic, if it was different?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Brian Kerr. I'm the minister in Greyfriars Church in Lanark, part of the Church of Scotland. We're an organisation that has been deemed the national church in Scotland for some time. We have approximately 1,000 parishes round about, and several hundred, 500 ministers serving within that. At the time of the pandemic, I was clerk to what was then the Presbytery of Lanark, and was asked to be involved in almost sense-checking some guidance for the Church of Scotland in terms of making sure it made sense and how it would be followed in the parishes and in the real world. And from that became a part of the COVID team, and then when staffing changes happened, was one of the folks that sat on the faith and belief group of the Scottish Government as well.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to start with the closure of premises. Now, Mr. Ladva, I understand your organisation doesn't have religious premises, so I'd ask that when answering these questions, you answer in respect of Hindu temples, please.
Sure.
Thank you. Could you each briefly tell us about the types of services, both religious and non-religious, your organisation or your religion provided in your premises? If we could start with you, Mr. Kerr.
So our purpose is the advancement of religion, and as a church, our main aim is to hold services of worship. That would be the main thing that happens in many of our churches throughout the week. But perhaps as significant to that is the amount of community work that we're involved in as well, whether that's providing support for community organisations, running organisations ourselves, running things like food banks, mental health support from the building. So there is a huge amount of variety that goes on in church buildings, and very often, since the closure of other public buildings, particularly in smaller communities, a church building is the only community space that's available. And that also proved quite challenging during the pandemic, because not only were we dealing with the places of worship guidance, but we were also having to look at youth work, catering and hospitality. We were really looking at all the different forms of guidance across, because of the variety and depth of things that happens in our buildings.
Thank you. Mr MacDonald, if we could move to you next.
Very similar to Mr Kerr. Buildings being used for Sunday worship, morning, evening, midweek, prayer meetings, Bible studies, things that you would expect to be the normal activities within a church. But beyond that, you have youth work groups, you have addiction groups, you have other organisations, whether it be dementia groups or cancer support groups, whatever, using church buildings fairly frequently. So all that was affected quite markedly, obviously, with the closing of buildings.
Thank you. And Mr Ladva.
So, as you mentioned, the Scottish Hindu Foundation doesn't have religious buildings itself. It represents the Hindu temples in Scotland. The traditional or normal day-to-day services are held, sometimes twice a day, depending on the congregation and the size of the congregation, in conjunction with youth activities, elderly services, open kitchens where people can come and get a meal, in addition to other kind of periphery services concerning mental health, yoga, meditation, chanting, music lessons, and a whole host of other services that support the community and act as a hub of services that the community is looking to participate in. The vast bulk of these things were moved online using tools like Zoom, Google Classroom, WhatsApp, and other tools to either still showcase these activities are going on. I was even made to go to a Vedic mathematics class, much to my annoyance.
Vedic mathematics?
Vedic mathematics, the oldest form of mathematics. We tried to impart these lessons and the kind of cultural things that we would normally do, still doing it online. If anybody's interested, please reach out. I'm more than happy to find a partner to suffer with. So, but these are the things that that were deemed important during this time of crisis. We've actually expanded those services now, as I mentioned in the previous segment of a session, that ISKCON, the International Society of Christian Consciousness, through the pandemic fed in upwards of 50,000 people, but their food program has continued. Dundee Hindu Temple has an open kitchen every weekend that the people can go along and have a hot meal, as Aberdeen Temple as well. They all have continued a lot of the services that they took online and brought back and revitalised.
Thank you. Now, you each mention in your statements the effects of the closure of buildings and the stopping of these services and worship sessions and so on. Mr. Lavda, you mentioned in yours that there was a sense of loss was felt by Hindu followers when temples were closed. Mr. MacDonald, you mentioned that life was dramatically turned upside down for people for whom the church and worship is everything. Mr. Kerr, you mentioned that you quickly saw a dramatic change in your congregation. I wonder if each of you could expand on those points. Perhaps we could start with you, Mr. MacDonald.
Certainly. The Lordship mentioned earlier today that even during the times of war, that church buildings were not closed. And that was something that was highlighted to me several times by folk within our congregation. I look back to that moment when I was required to make that announcement, not just to my own congregation, but because I was moderator that year, to the denomination. And I look back at the video message that we recorded for that, and genuinely I find it quite chilling looking at it now, because never in the history of Scotland have we told people that they cannot attend a place of worship. Mm-hmm. And although we understood the reasons why, it was really quite a profound moment in our history. As I said, for many people, you know, for whom faith is just central to everything, to be unable to attend a place of worship was something that was really quite disturbing. And we had to think about how did we deal with this unique situation that we were in. And we were trying to communicate to our people that although there was the closing of places of worship, there was not going to be the cessation of worship, that we were just going to have to find how to worship in a different way. And this is where we all very quickly became experts in live streaming and in IT. I think many ministers, wives, partners, whatever, suddenly had to become experts in live streaming, which was quite a thing. But we were very thankful that we had that technology available to us. Likewise, we had the privilege, for several years beforehand, had the privilege of having our services broadcast by local radio. And what we did find was that not only was that important for our immediate congregation, but for the community. We did find that probably 2, 3, maybe 4 times as many people were tuning into services once we had gone to live streaming and through the radio broadcasting. Again, in my role as moderator that year, again, we were seeking to minister to the whole denomination and beyond. So what we also started doing was broadcasting what was a weekly moderator's message every Friday. Privileged to live in the Isle of Skye, so I would go to the various tourist spots, which were beautifully empty at the time, and record just like a weekly message that went out. We were conscious that people were feeling isolated and also maybe feeling a bit claustrophobic in their own homes, but to be in a location each week where it was open and there was hopefully a message of encouragement each week, we found very useful. We also were faced with that situation with the closing of buildings. You no longer were together, knowing what each other's needs were or what the problems were you're facing. So we started organising, I suppose, what you call pastoral teams to make sure that every kind of person and section of the congregation was being looked after. It may be just through phone calls or whatever, just somebody to chat to. It may be to make sure that people were able to access groceries, foods, whatever, to deliver to them. So we tried to organise that as well for congregation and wider community. There was other community groups doing wonderful things as well, similar to that. But certainly that's the approach that we took as a church, was get the services live streamed, broadcast so that people could access it, and making sure that those that were under our care were not feeling isolated or alone.
Thank you. Mr. Ladva.
Sure. So this may come as a shock, but Hindus don't actually do idol worship. So the whole purpose of the main murtis, as we describe them in temples, is you go there to seek an audience with divinity. You're going there to have a one-to-one, effectively, with a higher power, and to take that away from people who require that. It was incredibly impactful and detrimental to a lot of people, especially the elderly who would come together to sing mantras, to sing ceremonial songs. That sense of communal worship was taken away, in addition to the individual acts of worship that Hindus would go to seek at their temples, mandirs. Now, as with the medical profession, a lot of our community members were present. We also had a lot of members of our community that were proficient in IT. So by March 2020, when the lockdown became apparent, the community mobilised, and by June, everything was moved online. Mouses, keyboards, screens, phones, any bits of tech that could be found in homes were shared and distributed. In Edinburgh, live streaming of services was conducted, and people could, turn their microphones on and still participate. It doesn't have the same impact, but the function is still there, and people still felt a part of it. The other twin problem that we had, or kind of faced, was language. A lot of the community, or a significant portion of it, I should say, were contractors from India, IT contractors, who didn't know the systems, may struggle with the language or navigating things. So WhatsApp groups were set up where communication could be shared, questions could be answered. I can speak to Edinburgh, where a network was established of those who had cars and those who didn't. So in the event of an emergency, a message could go out in the WhatsApp group, a car could be identified, and help could arrive. Whether it was delivering shopping, whether it was delivering even basic necessities. The one incident that does stick to mind is receiving a call at 2 a.m. where a child was sick, and they needed to get to the Royal Infirmary very quickly. Volunteers were woken up, childcare arrangements were made, and the family was transported to Royal Infirmary within the hour. So I go back to my earlier statement from the earlier segment, which is the Hindu community will find a way. Given whatever challenges in front of us, we will find a way to come together to show resilience and to meet the requirements. With regards to the actual activities within the community, again, because of proficiency in IT and the service, the caliber of people that we had, we even organised workshops on how to use some of these things. The temple priest, there's no expectation on them to know how to do these things, but by the end of the pandemic, they were able to conduct and stream these services on YouTube and Facebook Live by themselves. So, from our standpoint, any crisis is an opportunity to show resilience and to show that we can come together. The important thing was to provide those services to those who needed it and to identify those who were potentially vulnerable because of language or just if they'd been on the shores for only a few months and were locked down. Unfortunately, we also ran into another problem, which was in between the first and second lockdown, people were stranded in India or other parts where they'd gone to see their family. And now we needed to come up with a third layer of support, which is if the primary carer or if the primary earner was trapped and couldn't get back, we needed to be there for those individuals, those partners and kids and things. So a whole host of services were brought online to support those as well. But the ultimate objective from the temples was the importance of why these spiritual practices matter. It's in times of crisis that the spirit is held up and you're able to stay on task, stay focused, and not let the situation drag you down. And there's umpteen stories within our Hindu literature that talks to this of, being... Again, just to kind of paraphrase, which is, if you don't train your mind, it will act like an enemy. But if you do, it will act like your best friend. Taken directly from one of our scriptures, which was shared widely amongst many others to highlight why these things and practices and turning up, even if it's an online session, just to check in, was so important. I think I can speak for all the temples that they all did the best that they could, and in some instances went above and beyond to support those who needed it. And on the other side of it has led to the formation of the Scottish Hindu Foundation to act as a coordinator and as a face to the government to learn and to share these lessons.
Thank you. And Mr. Kerr.
Yeah, Billy, Donnie, I remember standing in my own church in Greyfriars, and I think we were all aware something was coming, and it was that last Sunday before we knew that we were going to have to broadcast from churches, and that the congregation couldn't be there, but we were still able to be there. And I think we managed one Sunday that way before the full lockdown. And I remember standing at the end of the service, and I watched it back actually on YouTube, because we already broadcast our services for about 10 years before that. And I watched it back last night, and I remember how emotional that was. Pronouncing the blessing at the end of a service to people that you knew would never set foot back in that building. A building that they had worshipped in for, in some cases, 80, 85 years. But you had a sense that if this pandemic was going to be what we thought it was, that the chances of them ever seeing the inside of that church for anything other than a funeral was slim. That was incredibly emotional for many ministers who found that, and I'm sure many who led worship in whatever faith, just that dawning realisation of what we were about to face. So in many ways, although we accepted that this was unprecedented, that we had never known a time when churches had closed or places of worship had closed, I think there was a recognition across most places of worship that actually, if this had to happen for people's safety, then it had to happen, and we had to find the best for that. And we did. And a bit like Ravi said, we all rallied round, and those of us who were already a bit more proficient in streaming helped others navigate and look. Our congregation were used to worshipping online at times. We've had folk in hospitals who, over the years, had nurses wheel televisions to their bedside so they could still join in worship. So we knew this would be an extension of that. And in Lanark, we actually provided phone lines and a system for other churches across Scotland to buy in to get a local phone line so that they could actually broadcast their service on a normal phone line that elderly people who maybe didn't have technology would at least be able to dial in a landline to listen to the service. And that was, at one point we had over 120 churches using that system across Scotland. It was an opportunity, and we did become proficient very, very quickly in what we had to do. And I suppose from that, a challenge that I found was when in March 2021 there was a judicial review of the closure of churches chaired by one of your colleagues, Lord Braid. And in that, there was a real challenge to some of us, because for the first time ever, we had a ruling about what worship was and wasn't. And quite by surprise to most people who read it, the judgment from Lord Braid said that online worship was not worship. And of course, it's what we had to do for the previous year and what some of us had been doing for a decade before. Now, it's always, you know, an ability for people to come together in whatever way, but to have that presented in a sheriff court judge or a sheriff review was really difficult. And it represented for us, those of us who were fairly proficient in technology, a kind of overstepping into a place where we were just getting used to not having churches open, never mind being told that what we're doing when they're not open is not what we thought we were doing. And so that brought a bit of a challenge with those who wanted to speed up getting back and those who were taking a slightly more cautious approach. And we found that really unhelpful in the Church of Scotland, because we had those two conflicting sides that we were trying to almost hold in tension for how we recognised that for every community, a return to whatever normality looked like would be different, depending on a whole host of circumstances. So as well as taking everything online, there was a short period where most things stopped, apart from the core event, the worship, because lots of groups had to find a way in which they could meet. But once people started to do that, we had guild groups, primarily made up of retired women, who were suddenly having coffee mornings on Zoom, who beforehand, if you'd looked at them with a mobile phone, their response might have been to throw it at you rather than use it. But all of a sudden we found that we could do these type of things, and we could still build community in a different way using these tools that were before us. And we had small groups set up for people who could check in with each other. We had phone trees, we had opportunities for quiz nights and quiz days and all sorts of things just to try and bring people in. I had one old lady, just to conclude this answer, who is now sadly no longer with us, and she was eccentric, told the best stories and had the church in stitches when she performed. She got dressed up every Sunday at 11 o'clock in her full Sunday best, with high heels, makeup, the whole works, because she said that joining church online was a marker in her week. when everything else was away, when everything else couldn't be relied on, the church starting at 11 o'clock on a Sunday that she could sit down and be a part of was for her as important as going to worship in the building. And I think for me that has stuck over these years, that there were people that depended on our organisations, our churches, our places of worship to provide that marker in a week that was filled with trying to find toilet rolls and queuing politely outside a branch of a supermarket. But there was some, at least, consistency for folks within their worship life.
Thank you. Now, I wonder, on the other side of that, what the effect was on officials within the organisation who weren't able to meet the congregation and community in person anymore, to provide pastoral care, to provide worship services in person. Do officials in your organisation generally feel a sense of obligation to provide in-person care and worship? And what was the impact on morale and mental health of not being able to do that? And if we could start with you, Mr. Ladva.
Sure. It was one of the important lessons that we learned as a community, that and I speak to Dundee and Aberdeen in particular, which are the furthest away from the main bulk of the demographics for Hindus in Scotland. I know Aberdeen struggled at first with trying to maintain some semblance of community and visibility with the priest and trying to engage the community, and Dundee doesn't have one at all. They are reliant on a priest coming up from Edinburgh, Glasgow, or coming down from Aberdeen. So when lockdown happened and they needed someone to perform ceremonies, they didn't have anyone. And yes, you can try and do it via online as much as you can, but some of these ceremonies and rituals do require someone to be there. And again, it's something that we will, as a foundation, take on board and try to address in the coming months and years. And again, my eternal gratitude to the Aberdeen Temple for, showing the resilience that they did in coming together to deploy the practices that they did in getting the temple priest to engage with the community through online services that they did, and showing that even though that they're isolated, that they're still connected to the wider community. The other side of it, and coming on the other side of the kind of COVID pandemic, the community quickly realised that it's one of the hardest things to do as a community is to find a priest, or to bring one over that is fully qualified. And I don't mean to, put this lightly, but a temple priest has the equivalent of a PhD in Hinduism, when they are trained from 5 upwards up to about 25 daily in Hindu practices, rituals, how to engage with the community, proficiency in English, and the visa system and general system to bring them over here is difficult. So it's something that we've been long wanting to address and just never had the mechanisms in place. But the pandemic really did expose how isolated and difficult it can become when you don't have that pillar of community. And I'm sure, from the Christian community, when you remove a pillar of community, someone like a priest or a reverend, it does have an impact. And it's no different for the Hindu community.
Mr. Kerr, if we could come to you next.
Yeah, it was interesting you asked if we feel an obligation. And I think, yes, but that's not a bad thing. And I think obligation can have negative connotations, but actually it's part of our calling. And it was a challenge for many ministers in the Church of Scotland to try and work out our place within that, because we were still having to go and take funerals, for example. And how do you do that when you can't meet with the family really beforehand? Many a cold November and December funeral was arranged on garden patio furniture with snow falling around us. And that can work in some instances, but where it's been a particularly traumatic episode or someone struggling with poor mental health and needs support, how do you provide the confidentiality and the support for folks? So I think the fact of us visiting and not being able to visit kind of shifted somewhat, where we would normally go and visit those who are sick. Very often that wasn't possible because of the hospitals. Now, there was an issue over getting into hospitals when we were meant to be able to get in to support families at end of life, and dependent on the hospital, that wasn't always welcomed or possible. But it shifted to support families who were going through challenges and difficulties as well. In terms of morale, it was really difficult because ministers, like the rest of the population, were also struggling with COVID and with the impact of the virus. Perhaps they had family members who were key workers and having to provide more of the childcare or homeschooling, as well as out supporting the community. For me personally, my ministry changed beyond recognition, where we set up with other charities in the community and other churches Lanark Helps, which was a phone line system, it was a shopping system, it was a friendship buddy system. We loaned out jigsaws and gave colouring books to adults and children to take time. All those things were really important. So we were out more and more, and we were very early adopters of providing ministers with a letter to say that they were out doing work, because no one thought that ministers needed that in the officialdom, whereas we knew that if our ministers were going to be stopped by the police, they had to be able to demonstrate that there was something official. So the then Principal Clerk, who you hear from in a couple of days, issued template letters that ministers could take. At that point, then our local authority heard about that, picked it up and started giving those letters out, which was really helpful. For many ministers, the pandemic gave an opportunity to serve the community in a new way. And some will actually speak, including myself, of being busier than we've ever been, being out and about. I mean, although we were, on lockdown at home, I don't think there was a day during lockdown I was not out and about doing things, supporting people, or doing the practical work of ministry. And so for that side of it, the lockdown was an interesting concept for those of us out supporting the community. Morale still has taken a hit, because we're now, as a denomination, beginning to live in real time the effects of the pandemic. In 2025, financially, as a denomination, we have major challenges that can be traced back to the pandemic and a lack of incoming resources in certain parts. So we are now beginning to see a lot of these changes that perhaps have been necessary, but the pandemic sped up by perhaps a decade than what we felt we had. And so morale across the organisation is still really low in many places, but it would be wrong to think that the pandemic didn't afford us opportunities as well.
Thank you. And Mr. MacDonald?
Yeah, again, similar to Mr. Kerr, when we think of our congregations, we don't see them as an obligation at all. They are family. And just like, a parent worries about their kids, whatever, when you're the pastor of a congregation, you really worry about those that are under your care. And of course, in a time of pandemic, that level of worry and concern just went through the roof, because you are concerned about everybody with their different situations, whether it be elderly folk that were feeling isolated, or those that were looking after a loved one with dementia, or those that had marriage or family problems, or those that had illness or were going through treatment. All this really lay heavy on you, and especially because you weren't able to be there with them. You could be there for them in the sense that, you know, you prayed for them, you phoned them, and so on, but you couldn't be with them. And there's something quite different. There's something powerful about presence, and you couldn't really offer that ministry of presence to folk. But there was a pandemic. There was no way around that, so we had to think what else to do. And that's where, like you said, Zoom meetings and you know, phone calls, FaceTime, WhatsApp, all these things became your means of ministering to the folk that were under your care. Not ideal, but that's what was there and available for us, and we're thankful for those things. I think it did put added stress onto myself and to colleagues as well. It also left you with a great sense of almost guilt. You felt that you were neglecting your people. I know that for some it did create quite high levels of anxiety and perhaps mental health issues as well. So it wasn't without effect. And I think that continues to be the case even when things have got back to normal. There's still something of the aftermath of that we're still trying to process and deal with. In particular, I know it refers back to the last session, but dealing with families at time of bereavement in particular was very, very difficult. Arranging funerals over a phone or via Zoom, only seeing the families at the graveside, not being able even to go and give them a hug. These things were difficult to deal with, and I think, as I say, we're still seeing something of the aftermath of that.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Kerr, you've already touched on my next question, which is about the effect of the pandemic on staff and officials who had to shield and those who were left to work in the community, and the lack of key worker status. I wonder whether you'd like to expand on that before I give the others the opportunity to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, ministry is a strange profession in that, well, it's a strange profession anyway, but particularly in COVID, because you do have to cover for each other. It's not like going on holiday in an office where either the work gets left or somebody else will answer the phone. It's very, very different. If you want a Sunday off, you have to arrange someone to take that. You have to arrange someone to provide cover within the parish. When ministers had to shield or were ill through with COVID, it did put an extra stress on others who were able to do. But of course, that was always a movable feast, because at any time you could have, 3 or 4 ministers in a small area off with COVID at any one time because of the way the virus spread and moved. I think one of the things that we advocated for quite strongly was the fact that with ministers and religious leaders doing so much in the community, in fact, the chief executive of our local authority at that time said to me, kind of as we were coming out of pandemic, he said, if it weren't for churches and other places of worship, our council would not have coped. It would have gone under, just because of the sheer volume of feeding people and supporting. So there was that recognition of we were there to do the work and to help out. But we also didn't have the official recognition as key workers. So therefore, unlike funeral directors, for example, or even receptionists in funeral parlours, we weren't eligible for the vaccinations when they came on stream. Instead, ministers had to wait until it was their turn, whenever that was. Now, we argued that the fact that we were involved in the community work in supporting other key workers, in supporting the infrastructure of the community, meant that we should be doing it. And I remember having a conversation with the National Clinical Director at one point when he said, well, if we give them to you, you tell me who we're not giving them to. And I know there were difficult balancing decisions to make, but we felt, given the reliance and the heavy reliance on the places of worship by society, that actually this would have been something that would have strengthened that, so that we could have made even more inroads. So it was stressful. We had ministers covering 3 or 4 parishes. We had those that were shielding. We also had those that were nervous, and whether they were shielding because they had to or because they were anxious, it was the same effect. And of course we were already ministers down with vacancies and things, so we had ministers covering all different parts, and in areas that crossed over local authority borders. For example, you might have a minister in Glasgow covering a second parish in South Lanarkshire, for example. When they were in different levels and different tiers, that created profound problems in terms of crossing over, until we managed to get the fact that a minister crossing over in course of our work was not an offence. So I think there were all those different challenges that were there. It was busy. It was busy on officials in our national offices and those of us writing guidance and trying to keep up with things. But I think we all did it to support the people we were supporting, whether that was colleagues or our community, no matter how difficult it was.
Thank you. Mr MacDonald, to come to you next.
Yeah, I think I also mentioned in my statement about not being recognised as a key worker. In some ways that was problematic. Even although I do serve part-time as an NHS chaplain, even then was not recognised in some ways as a key worker. So it meant that for, again, things like end-of-life care, I've seen me standing outside a hospital window while praying with somebody on the phone as the daughter held the phone to the mother's ear and things like that. These were the kind of issues that you were facing. But at the same time, again, like I mentioned, we were in a pandemic. And one of the stresses I think we felt was that much as we would love to have been able to get access into the hospitals as key workers or to do other things as key workers, we also had the potential to catch and spread the virus around those who were most vulnerable. If we went to visit somebody who was sick, caught the virus, and you go to visit someone else who's sick, you bring the virus. Again, there was that pressure that you felt. It wasn't about protecting yourself as much as that great burden. You wanted to protect others as well. So you felt really caught. There was a real tension there between your desire to be with people, but at the same time not to bring any harm to anybody that you wanted to be with.
Thank you. And Mr Ladva.
The community found itself in between a rock and a hard place, as so many of our community members work in the NHS. They would be, engaged in practices of worship. They would be engaged in online sessions, knowing full well that they now have to go to the front line and support the community. And it was difficult to, send them off. And and through the course of writing this witness statement, you realise how much the community really put together and thought things through. Essentially a volunteer army of support staff and support colleagues were assembled where, if you had some semblance of expertise in music, you could hold a concert and that would fill a spiritual gap somewhere. So the community wasn't stretched thin. Within Hinduism itself, there is a focus on detaching yourself in times of crisis from your emotion to the task at hand. And it was almost kind of the unspoken rule, which is when these people are going to effectively the front line of COVID and serving in the hospitals or care homes, that we let them stay on task and let them stay on focus and not to break their concentration. And we leave the spiritual practices to the priests and this, kind of second layer of volunteers that provide all these services like Vedic mathematics and yoga. And the fascinating thing for me is that, and we were discussing this briefly, the value of tradition, the value of passing down knowledge and institutional memory. that all these things that we were doing in community are things our ancestors at some point spoke about, and the things that they did, and we were able to discern very quickly, okay, what's practical, what isn't, what should be applied, what shouldn't. And thankfully, inquiries like this will do that for future generations, where it will be stored in the National Archives, and in the event of, and touch wood, not for a while or ever, in the event of another pandemic or situation, we can draw upon wisdom like this and say, well, this is what worked in 2019 and onwards, and this is what we can do now. The lessons, and I think I can speak for the entire community when I say this, the two real contrasting points is that the community was eternally grateful to the government for the way that they did behave, and gaps were exposed, especially when it came to the release of financial aid. A lot of the temples and a lot of places of worship are reliant on donations, and people, as a part of their act of worship, donating those sums. Now, if they can't turn up and donate those sums, that gap still has to be filled. Things still have to, be paid for effectively. So eventually, when things did settle down and a rhythm was achieved between the community and the government, funds were released. But that delay, could have been problematic, had there not been this second layer of volunteers stepping up and providing services and, filling gaps where required. And one of the, again, lessons that came out of, going back over some of these things is the challenge in talking to one another. The way that we want to be treated and the way that we understand one another is one of the gaps that came out. I know we spoke about it through the funeral rites and other kind of important moments, but just in the day-to-day, when the pandemic really started, the government's point of call was one priest in Glasgow for the entirety of the Hindu community in Scotland. Eventually, the community realised that the pandemic is here and it's not going any time soon. More volunteers were put in front of the government, and we've learnt those lessons. We've put a national body together so that at least from our end we've addressed our problem, and I'm hoping that lessons come from the government that at least honest actors are engaged in times of crisis, so communication can be both received and shared.
Thank you. Now, you've each touched on the effect generally on your communities, but I'd like to ask you specifically about disproportionate impacts on certain groups within your communities. For example, the elderly, particularly those elderly with dementia, on disabled people, on ethnic minorities, low-income households, single-family households and the like. I wonder if you could tell us about the impact on those groups, any support your organisations were able to offer those groups, and whether those supports were funded through the Scottish Government or local authority funding or through your organisations. And if we could start with you, Mr. MacDonald.
Obviously, that there are certain groups that are going to be much more vulnerable. The elderly, in particular, were, I suppose, feeling more isolated. For many of them, the delivery of the post was the highlight of the day. He had contact with somebody. I would say that probably the elderly, certainly with ourselves in Skye, that they were maybe more resilient than some of the younger folk were. Much more pragmatic about the situation, but it was still difficult, and especially for those that perhaps were acting as carers to their loved ones. Again, as I've mentioned earlier, we did try to give support just through our pastoral teams and contact phoning, making sure that they had everything that they needed. We were conscious, I think I mentioned in the statement too, the way in which young carers were impacted. Those that were effectively looking after parents. For them, there was an enormous stress because sometimes they were the ones responsible for going to get the shopping or whatever, but terrified that they were going to bring something back to their parents. At a personal level, we got more of an insight. I think I mentioned the statement that in the summer of 21, I got diagnosed with an incurable cancer, and we still had two of my children were in school at the time, and we had to go through further kind of lockdown, isolation. But it gave me an insight to what these young carers were having to carry, because I could see in my own children that they were terrified of being the one responsible for Dad's death, if you like. That, you know, when you're in your primary school age or early teens, that's an intolerable burden to carry. Again, it's hard to know what else you could have done about that. You know, the reality was what it was. But I think in reflection, I wish we knew how we could have better have supported children in that situation. There's a fantastic group that's called Young Carers, Scandal House Carers, that were very much helping children in that situation, but I think they were a much neglected kind of group. I was also aware at the time, I don't know if you would call them a minority group, but teachers who also were feeling incredible stress at that time, not just in delivering their lessons and stuff online, but several teachers that I spoke to for whom their burden was children who were in difficult situations and for whom school was a safe place. Mm-hmm. And again, the burden they carried, thinking about what those children were having to face at home when there was no place of escape. These were the sort of things. Obviously, folk with addictions, we mentioned about the closing of buildings, but the support groups for people with addictions, you know, that very significant. A number of my colleagues who were running road to recovery groups and things like that were, again, that was something that very much concerned them, because again, part of your weaponry against falling back into your addiction is the strength you get from the community that you're sharing things with, and that was removed. So there was various groups. Sorry, I'm warbling on here a wee bit. I'll be quiet. But there was lots of groups like that you know were really struggling, and I think a number fell between the cracks. There wasn't always the support that was needed.
Thank you, Mr. Ledva.
The two key groups, aside from the people that were on the front line of this, were the elderly and I would say the students as well. Mm. For the elderly, it was a combination of both spiritual isolation, language isolation, and that manifested in ways that we, again, at the time, you didn't realise that, okay, this would become an issue, but one of them was dietary requirements. Most Hindus are vegetarian, or and did tie it intimately to their spiritual practices. So, in a state of pandemic where they're in hospital and they need to eat, it was one of the areas that was, very quickly isolated, and we had to engage with hospitals and say, please try to, be cognizant of, these dietary requirements as best you can, and where meals could be provided, those services were brought online very quickly. For students, it was a combination of the experience of, at a university level, I'm paying to go to university, am I getting the outcome? And education is one of the pillars of our community where it's valued above and beyond most things, unfortunately, for, sometimes, in a very demanding way. Even from my own childhood, I can reference stories where you get a 99 and parents are like, what happened to that other one? And who should have got 100? Obviously, in a pandemic situation, those things become amplified, where you're not only feeling the pressure of attainment, but feeling the pressure of missing out. So the other kind of combination for the student was economics, where other students who had come over as foreign students would expected to kind of pay for their way by working, in the fast food industry or any of the service industries. Now having that cut off from them, a lot of pressure was put on families to provide financial support where required. Thankfully, Temple sprang into action, provided meals where they could provided assistance where they could, and brought national institutions, National Hindu Students Forum, the National Students for Indian Students Association came online to support these students. I think overall, looking at the spectrum, again, all this is doing is exposing gaps in care and understanding of the community. One of the kind of points that was highlighted, when I was speaking to the temples was, would the government know that the Hindus were here if we didn't tell them? And let alone our needs and what we regard as part of our obligations as Hindus. We're more than happy to acquiesce and serve the country, but at some point, it needs to be a give and take. And one of the common themes are, when engaging with the temples is, there needs to be more dialogue between the community and the government, so that they understand that, we're here to help and we're here to serve, but, there are things that we need in order to do that.
Thank you. And Mr. Kerr.
Yeah, I can't disagree with anything that the others have said, and whilst we didn't have any data that we captured on how many churches were involved in these projects, I think the vast majority were involved in supporting each of these groups, whether it was elderly or students in city centres or school children, those that were in areas of high deprivation, helped with people with food and finance. And what I would say is that, because you asked about how this was funded as well, most of this for the Church of Scotland, and I'm sure it would be the same for others, would have been funded from our own resources. And that saddens me. Because, again, a bit like going back to the key worker discussion, we were doing so much and propping up a system with social care and support, but yet having to use our own limited resources, financial, in order to do that. Now, it's true, there were funds available. There was a Scottish Government Resilience Fund, which came in really quite quickly, that there were some that were able to get out of that. But I looked last night to the 7th of May 2020, so a very short period of time from when that was started. They had given out, the government fund had given out about 17.9 million in that fund. At that time, 11 Church of Scotland congregations had received funding from that fund, totalling £73,000, so 0.4%. Now, there were other funds that came about that you could get funding for various projects that you could do, and many tapped into some of them, whether that was through local TSIs or local authorities. The government brought in the Adapt and Thrive, which was the recovery fund later on, and that was a bit more successful. I think there were about 20-odd congregations in our denomination got about £500,000, and that was in order to change what they were doing in order to be more robust, and some got that for digital infrastructure or things like that. There was one in Edinburgh for enhanced bereavement support, for example. But the one that really causes me great angst was that the government, Scottish Government, gave away about £4.7 billion in grants for business support, 134 schemes, from wedding industry to events to every industry under the sun that you could think of. And places of worship were ineligible for them all as places of worship, because many of them, give you one example, there was one, the business recovery, if it was the business bounce back scheme, businesses, small businesses were entitled to a £10,000 grant to help plug a little gap. That was tied to the non-domestic rates programme for speed of delivery. But of course, the one group in Scotland that is exempt from paying non-domestic rates by law are places of worship. Now, other charities have discretionary relief from the government and councils, but because they were still on the register, they were still able to get that fund, but because places of worship were exempt, we missed out on all of that. Now, something like that could have been transformational for all of our places that were doing that support. We raised this several times at government level, at minister level, and we received the shrugging of the shoulders and told, well, that's the word, there's nothing we can do about it. But yet the scheme was expanded and extended and changed slightly. I think, go back to what Ravi said earlier about there needing to be more dialogue and the fact that we are here to help. I think that is true of all of our systems. And as the Church of Scotland, we have a better seat at the table than most, if we're being really honest. But if we are going to be used as organisations to help take care of people, to help prop up a failing system in state or whatever that might be, there also needs to be that dialogue about how we can get the resources and how we can be helped to make best use of those funds. And that was missing for places of worship as places of worship throughout the majority of the pandemic.
Thank you. Now, I did want to, I do have questions for you to go further into depth on financial matters, as well as the timing of guidance, the impact that had on having worship on a Sunday when things were reopening or not. The appropriateness of guidance. I know, Mr. Kerr, that your organisation took at one point went against the official guidance and followed the library guidance. However, I am conscious of time, and I would rather give you the opportunity to highlight matters that are particularly, that you consider to be particularly important for His Lordship to hear, rather than what I might consider to be more important. So with that, I'd like to ask you if you'd like to highlight particular points that we haven't covered in evidence today, but please do bear in mind that everything you have provided us in your written statement will be considered and will form part of the evidence. And if we could start with you, Mr. Ladva.
I think the lessons from the pandemic for the community were, don't expect government to be there all the time, and there needs to be an element of self-sufficiency. The community has come together to take those steps, whether it's setting up Scotland's International Yoga Day, whether it's setting up the foundation, setting up the Hindu Economic Forum, setting up more resilient activities within the temples, and just general inter-community dialogue, and now expanding to interfaith dialogue as well. The financial aspect of this is that the government should be looking at return on investment. If you look and evaluate that in a capitalist society or in a business sense, that the incentive is profit motive, that to generate profit. But from a community aspect, it's actually to reinvest those back into the community. So we have a completely different model on how we approach things. And in a situation like COVID, where yes, economy needed to be propped up, but so did the people needed to be propped up, and there should have been at least a better dialogue, as it's been communicated, on where those funds and resources go and how they are distributed. I mean, they could have been distributed in waves, where one gets one wave, next gets the next. So there is an anticipation and planning into what activities can be rolled out and support be rolled out. I think from the Hindu community perspective, it's learning, making sure that we've learned the lessons, and that in the event of the next kind of episode or next kind of a major event that affects Scotland as a whole, that the relevant partners are at the table that can bridge these gaps and resolve some of these issues and pain points that we have. One of the sentiment that's come screaming out of at least the witness statements is that there is no doubt that the Scottish Hindu community feels intimately more tied to Scotland than it has ever before. the appreciation for the government and the things that it said, but it's not without failure and fault in recognising that there were moments where the community was left isolated, and had it not been for inter-community and other communities teaming up, that there would have been a gap in information and practices, especially concerning PPE and guidance on how to navigate this pandemic. As far as the community is concerned, the aim now for the community is to make everyone self-reliant. And through self-reliance, you have a level of freedom in decision-making. And through that freedom, you have options. And through a pandemic, that's essentially what you're looking for, rather than being forced into a decision. So from here on out, at least from the Hindu community's perspective, we will be doing everything that we can to make Scotland far more resilient and at least make the Hindu community more visible through partners and programs and things that we do. And I'm hoping, beyond hope, that the government is willing to engage and the public services are willing to engage with us. So that we are again having that shared dialogue and having those plans and implemented correctly.
Thank you. And Mr. Kerr?
Yeah, some of the things you mentioned there about guidance, I think we should, when we're talking about worship and life events, actually pay tribute to the Faith and Belief Unit within the Scottish Government, and for the Scottish Government in setting that up. I think as a team, they worked tirelessly with us throughout the pandemic, understood our challenges, our frustrations, and took them away, and were very often a conduit through whom we could say, well, that's not working, we need to think about this and move it forward. So I think thank you to them needs to be afforded from our perspective. I think from the pandemic, it became aware very quickly there was a profound lack of understanding from government about what places of worship did. And places of worship were not just places in which we worshipped. Because when the guidance started to come out, it was all about the worship, but nothing about all the other activities that went on around it. And so, as you'd mentioned about the timing of guidance, in early days, getting them on a Friday night at 6 o'clock, when some of our religious colleagues went into Sabbath a few hours later, was not profoundly helpful. We started getting slight notice of what was likely to come, and we worked that through with the government. But also the fact that we were not just reading the places of worship guidance, sometimes on which we were consulted, but we were also having to read the education guidance, the childcare guidance, the health guidance, the catering and hospitality guidance. So when these all dropped on a Thursday or Friday, we were scrabbling to try and get them written in time for what we could do. One of the challenges that we had as places of worship was we were always behind other sectors for the vast majority of things, except once when we were about the last to close or the first to open up. Can't remember which way round it was. And that was because of the four harms model that the government employed. And one of the four harms was economic harm. Now, as places of worship, we will never, ever peak an economic harm gauge. But what we will do is peak things like the direct impact or indirect impact to health. We will absolutely peak the social and emotional and community well-being. But those were at times during the pandemic given a much lesser status than the economic harm. And so that's why when people left church on a Sunday, they couldn't have a cup of coffee in the church hall, but they could go next door to the cafe all together and have a cup of coffee, because the cafe was able to open because they peaked the economic harm, but the churches weren't able to offer a coffee because they didn't. And it was just things like that that we perhaps needed more cohesion across the sectors in order that we could begin to make sense and explain to our folks who were asking, why can this group meet but that group can't in our church halls? And we were trying to allow them to journey with us, but it would make it much easier if those sensible decisions could be made across sectors, if it were ever to happen again, rather than having things pigeonholed so that we weren't able, as people who were supportive of the government, weren't able to actually comprehend why decisions had or had not been made.
Thank you. And Mr MacDonald.
You'll be glad to know I really don't have much to add to that. I think you've covered most things, but we mentioned that in the earlier session, that sometimes just that lack of communication, discussion, sort of affected things, the inconsistency in the way that things were applied across various sectors. You mentioned the coffee element we were conscious to. I mean, one of the big things for people of faith and worship is praise. And, you know, to be banned from singing, no, I was about to say you'll not remember the advert for fruit pastels. You've got to chew it. To go to church and not sing is a really difficult thing to do. And yet we're being asked to do that. But if you'd gone to the football match, you could sing. You know, it's that kind of things that was difficult for people within faith and communities and involved in worship, where you could see coffee, yes, there, but not here. Singing there, yeah, but not here. Masks here, but I think somebody mentioned for the weddings one, where you went to the wedding service with wearing a mask, but you went to the reception not wearing a mask. It was these inconsistencies that people found, I think, hard to cope with. But I keep coming back to it. It was a unique situation that we were in, and I think we appreciate that. So even the things we've said, I don't come over as being over critical. These are the lessons you learn. But at the time, we were appreciative of everything that was being done to try and protect people from what was a deadly virus. And I think sometimes we forget that. And for Tree, as I said, the funeral, I was fascinated listening to the funeral session later, but in the space of about 3 months, I think I did about 30, 40 funerals. You know, so you were surrounded by it. So in my mind, I still remember just the horror of the way in which it was taking people's lives. Not everybody had that experience. I think sometimes we look back with vaccinated, coloured spectacles, forgetting just how scary it was at the time. So that's why I appreciate everything that was done, even though, as you said, there's lessons to be learned.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Rama. Thank you all, gentlemen. Very grateful for your evidence this afternoon. That's us for the day. We'll adjourn now, and we're not starting till 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, so 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.